Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
How to Survive College Science. A long horror story from Reddit Nosleep. In the morning, Cassie found a time that Josh, her, and I could meet without having to skip class. Even with everything going on, we still had our grades to prioritize. I wanted to laugh or scream at that thought. I wasn't sure which. The devil had promised I would graduate, but he didn't stipulate that I'd graduate as myself. It was still raining when we left the apartment to meet up with Josh. A light drizzle. Not even enough to create puddles on the sidewalks, but it hadn't escaped either of our notice that the rain hadn't stopped in the handful of hours of sleep we'd managed to snatch. Neither did it give any indication that it was going to stop today either. We'd gotten lucky, and our schedules coincided with Professor Monotone's office hours. Cassie and I had decided that it was time to not only bring in everyone we could for help, but it was also time to get everything out in the open between us. We'd had a brief discussion on whether this should include James, but while it seemed fair to involve him considering it was his survival we were discussing, we were also concerned that if he found out there was a way to get Grayson out of his old body, he'd decide to go with that, and we'd have yet another adversary to deal with. My survival was on the line now, too. So, we met up with Josh, and then the three of us headed over to the geology department to crowd into Professor Monotone's office. He was visibly surprised to see so many students showing up at his office hours. I wasn't sure I'd seen him shocked before. Monsters and ghosts? NBD. A bunch of students actually showing up for his office hours? Earth-shattering. We need to talk about the monsters on campus, I said as Josh shut the door behind him. We've got some big problems. He glanced between the three of us and then down at his desk. No, at the two chairs in front of the desk. Then he sighed and stood, rummaging around in his desk drawers and finally coming up with a briefcase. Let's go somewhere else then, he said. This office is way too small for all of us. And that would get us off campus. That didn't escape my notice. Bemused, we followed his lead and wound up in his car, heading towards his house, and I sat in the back wondering if this was all okay, if a professor could just nope out on whatever commitments he had for the rest of the day and have a bunch of students hang out at his house. This was college, though. Things were different, right? Cassie and Josh seemed completely unbothered by the situation, but maybe that's because they're not anxious like a chihuahua at bath time like I am. He had a small house in an old neighborhood, judging by the size of the trees that lined the side of the road. Also, the guest bathroom fixtures were avocado green. I feel like that's a giveaway for the age of the house. He let us raid the garage fridge for drinks, and then we all congregated in the living room to get everyone up to date on what was happening. Cassie did all the talking because she's better at that sort of thing than me. I just sat there and fiddled with my can and tried to pretend no one was looking at me because I was the reason we were here. All of this was my fault. Then when she was done, I filled them in on what I knew and had learned from Grayson about the whole original president wanted to be immortal, and apparently that's all backfired horribly and locked campus in somebody's stealing cycle. Also, I said miserably, I saw a photo of the original group that helped him entrap Grayson. I think you're related to one of them. Professor Monotone. I'm fairly sure he became the groundskeeper in the cemetery, although I used his real name instead of Monotone. I live in terror of letting that particular nickname slip someday and regret my choice to use it, but too late to change it now. Well, they never did find a body, he murmured to himself. Interesting. Maybe that's why I never had any issues in the graveyard. If only I could learn to be that calm someday. He heaved himself to his feet and wandered off down a hallway. We sat there in silence, listening to the sound of someone pulling things out of a closet. At one point it sounded like a bunch of stuff fell over. Professor Monotone yelled down the hallway that he was fine, and we waited some more. This is awkward, Cassie whispered. Finally, he came back carrying a photo album. He set it down in front of me and opened it up. That the person you're thinking of? He asked. Yep. It was. We'd confirmed that Professor Monotone is indeed a descendant of the original participants. Unfortunately, that's not extremely helpful to our current predicament. There was a lot of family history lost between then and now. Monotone's parents had left, and he was born and raised somewhere else. almost on the other side of the country, in fact, so he didn't see his grandparents much. They passed before he moved back to this town, and he only did so because he was struggling to find work after his last job turned into a living hell. Don't work for a for-profit college, he told us. He'd applied here on a whim, thinking he wouldn't get it because it was so far away, and was quite startled to be accepted. Guess the whole ancestry thing explains that, he said. I wonder if your Grayson friend had anything to do with that. He doesn't really keep track of the descendants, he said. I replied. The board might have something to do with it, though. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. There was silence in the room afterwards, and we all stared at each other hopelessly as the implications of his theory settled in. I don't think the board is aware of the ghosts and such, he said. Maybe individuals are, but as a whole, I don't think they have anything to do with it. I think campus has a will of its own that's driving all of this. Then he clarified that this was just a hunch, and he didn't actually have any proof other than the holiday parties, which was about the only time he got to mingle with the board members. We all sat uneasily with that thought for a moment. It made a horrible sort of sense. The original president kicked off a cycle that campus itself was perpetuating, like the changing of the seasons, the progression of the semesters. I keep thinking about that piece of petrified wood, Monotone said thoughtfully. The tree isn't entirely gone. Stone and doors. That jolted my memory. Grayson had wanted to see it. He'd held it, but gingerly, and not for long. At the time it hadn't meant anything to me, but knowing now what Grayson is, I understood why he hadn't wanted to touch it much. It had burned the flickering man, after all. Do you think it still works? Professor Monotone was saying. With the tree dead, and all? There was a moment of contemplation, and then Cassie spoke up. Let's try it on James, she said. I think it's a mark of how desperate we are that no one argued with that idea. We moved the party to our apartment, as it was closer to campus, and James already knew where it was. Josh unfortunately had to bow out at that point. Not that he was contributing much other than moral support, he said wryly. But we promised to let him know if we needed him for anything. Professor Monotone showed no inclination to leave, however. He was more animated than I'd ever seen him, which is understandable. If I'd been on campus long enough to be eligible for tenure, I'd be pretty excited to be getting some answers as to what is going on around here with the monsters. James wasted no time coming over to the apartment after he texted him and asked for his help. He was trying to be helpful and communicative, which was the least he could do considering what he'd done to our friend. He was also going to her classes to maintain attendance, though he wasn't sure he could pass finals for her. I wasn't worried about that. Grayson had put us on a much tighter deadline than the end of the school year. His left hand was heavily bandaged when he came in. We all noticed. Well, Cassie and I noticed, not sure about Monotone, who was studying the petrified heart, and James looked sheepish and perhaps a little bit panicky under our scrutiny. What happened? Cassie asked sharply. Please don't get mad, he said. But I was, slipping. Cassie's eyes were steadily growing wider, a sure sign of her building temper. James began to talk faster. I didn't want to lose hold of this body, he continued, not meeting our eyes, so I did what I usually do to keep myself grounded. Cassie's anger abated slightly into confusion. I, however, felt fear clench at my stomach with icy fingers. You stabbed yourself, I said quietly, like he was as a ghost. Stabbed over and over and over. It's not a good method, I'm sorry, but it works. I told them it was a kitchen accident. It's only 3 stitches. I took a deep breath. I wanted to scream. Cassie seemed like she was about to explode, ready to unload on James for everything, I suspect. Here, Professor Monotone said, choosing the perfect time to interrupt. Try holding this for a minute for us. He shoved the stone at James. And James, grateful for an interruption, took it without further questions. It rested in his hands, and after a moment he sighed, the tension in his shoulders visibly bleeding away. He closed his eyes and ran his fingers over its surface. It feels right, he finally said. I feel calmer when I touch it. His face twitched, and his jaw went slack. He tried to say something, but only his throat moved, and his lips remained half-parted and silent. I snatched the stone out of his hands. We stared at him in apprehension, and I was about to tell Cassie to go get a knife so we could stab him again, when his eyes popped open with a deep gasp. He glanced around the room, startled, as if he'd just woken up from a deep sleep. "Holy shit," he said. "That was weird."
It was.
He swallowed hard, pulling me in. There was silence in the room for a moment. I handed the heart to Cassie, who put it on the other side of the room from James. I stood there uncomfortably for a moment, trying to formulate an apology to James for whatever had almost happened. "Let's try it on a different ghost," Professor Monotone said. "Didn't you say there's a couple still lingering on campus?" So that set off a firestorm.
Well.
Okay, it was really just Cassie and Professor Monotone getting into it. Her position was, "Why would you ask Ashley? Because I think we all know by now that I am incapable of volunteering myself to do these things. To do something dangerous when we have no idea what's going to happen, which is problematic in of itself." And Professor Monotone's position was for science, of course. I am dead serious. Those exact words were uttered. Professor Moton is lucky he was drawn to geology, because I'm not convinced he would have survived some of the other sciences. "I think we should do it," James interrupted, effectively ending the argument. It didn't feel like that thing was trying to do anything bad. Maybe it's just going to help them pass on. I just don't want to do that because I have a body still. They don't. He'd said that he'd escaped out of desperation, that it felt like he was losing himself there, to the point he'd resorted to stabbing himself over and over, and a thought occurred to me. If the things with which he was stabbed changed every day, then did it mean that he had to keep doing this? Indefinitely? Just to hold on? What did that say about the other ghosts on campus? So, I joined in favor of seeing what happened. Cassie shot daggers at me with her eyeballs, but she was very much outvoted. It was the voice of reason versus Team Poke It, and see what happens. I did have other reasons for trying this, some vague half-formed theory about how if the tree is pivotal in everything that's happening on campus, then it's no coincidence that a piece of it remained in our possession. I kept it to myself. "I'd love to come along and see what happens," Professor Monotone said, "but I have a bunch of first-year students that I need to fail. They have an exam in half an hour. I can't wait to see who didn't study." He sounded so gleeful. Getting to know your professors outside of class is wild. We didn't want to bring James as we felt that might be asking for trouble. He wasn't very keen on going anyway. Didn't want to come into contact with the other ghosts in case they tried to oust him like he'd ousted Maria.
So it was just Cassie and me.
Cassie would hold the door. I'd find the steam ghost because I'm good at that sort of thing. Finding Inhumans. And Josh would be our designated survivor, I guess, to carry on if everything went wrong and we were never seen again. Lucky him. "I hate everything about this," Cassie grumbled as we snuck downstairs to the basement of our former dorm. "We don't actually know what we're doing." "I'm starting to suspect not knowing what you're doing is a big part of being an adult," I replied. She couldn't argue with that. As agreed, she kept the door behind me open so I'd have a quick escape route, and so that the door would open to the basement and not to anywhere else. I was just relieved that the basement was normal. The last time I was down here, it was full of roots and swallowed up my manager, who I'm fairly sure is fine. I haven't seen him since the graveyard, but my next shift is in a few days, so guess we'll find out. The roots were gone, vanished back into the ground with the death of a tree. The steam tunnel was empty, swelteringly hot, and deceptively mundane. I walked inside, holding the stone heart in front of me with both hands, my own heart beating rapidly with nervousness. I didn't get extremely far. The steam poured out of the walls like the morning mist, swirling around me like a tornado, obscuring my vision so that I couldn't see anything in front of me but a hazy gray wall. Behind me, I heard Cassie calling my name, and I mentally recorded her direction so that I'd know the way out. I had to stay calm. I had to keep my wits on me, because that was the only thing I had going for me. I had a thought, belatedly, that perhaps we should have switched roles between Cassie and me. I guess I'm carrying the inhuman in my veins now, with the whole drinking the death water thing and all. And turns out the steam ghost really doesn't like that. The mist split apart, and something emerged out of it, an oval blur, 2 indentations like eyes, and a whole lot of other details that I absolutely couldn't make out through the fog covering my glasses. I knew what it was, though, as I recoiled in fear. The steam ghost. I'd seen it do this to Grayson. It had attacked him just like this. That was my last thought before it hit me in the chest. I felt the blow to my sternum, knocking all the air out of my lungs, and when I instinctively sucked in new air I only got steam, scalding, burning me up from the inside. I gasped, I choked, and then I felt screaming deep inside my chest, soundless, wordless, but screaming, because I was angry, so angry, and that was the only thing holding me together anymore. I'd had a life, and it wasn't much, but it was mine, but they'd taken it. Grayson. Was it Grayson that had taken that life? The thought was a single point of clarity, like a drop of water in my mind. And the torrent stopped for a moment, it swirled like coals in my lungs, and I remembered, and I don't know if those memories are mine or his, walking through these tunnels, towards an abandoned tunnel that few knew existed, and the door that should be locked at the end, the door that was locked at the end, but not for me, never for me. The water. The dark, endless pool of water like a mirror, like a hole in the world itself, that seemed to know who we were. Did I fall in? Was I pushed? Did I throw myself in? Pain lanced at my arms. There were hands around my wrists, sharp fingernails digging into the skin, and then they were wrenched up and out, shoving the stone hard into the air, where it touched the steam all around me. There was a gust of air, too hot to bring any reprieve from the sweltering heat, which swirled around me and lifted the few strands of hair that weren't plastered to my face and neck by sweat. I felt it rushing over my skin, the heat like sticking my hands into an oven, and then I could breathe. The air felt painfully cold in my lungs. The gray haze cleared, spiraling down, vanishing into the stone held out in front of me, clasped between my hands. There were hands on my wrists, forcing them out and away from my body, and I recognized the color of the nail polish. "See," Cassie said, panting slightly from where she stood directly behind me. "This is why we don't do this shit alone." I nodded in reply, but I wasn't entirely listening. I was waiting for the panic to drain out of my blood, but more, I was feeling the change to the stone that I held in my hands.
Warm.
It was warm, on the edge of being hot. Like the steam. It's been 6 hours since we left the tunnels. It is still raining, and the stone is still warm to the touch.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.